Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to my 40K channel, and today I'd like to go over 3 bits of advice for those of you who are just starting to get into this hobby. Going into this hobby, there's a whole range of pieces of advice that you could get from any number of websites, YouTube channels, or what have you. Hell, the first draft that I did of this was, I don't know, like top 10 pieces of advice, but when I then recorded, it was like 30 minutes long, and no one wants to listen to me for 30 minutes. So, reduced it down to 3. And a lot of these, you're going to go out to various different places, and you're going to hear some of the same ones over and over again, like say thin your paints, too thin coats.
Apply too thin coats,
things like that. But today are 3 tips that I had to learn, not necessarily something very specific in regards to like a paint scheme or something like that, but things that I ended up having to learn the hard way that I kind of wish somebody, told me ahead of time 5 years ago when I started doing this hobby. So without further ado, let's go into those 3 things. So for item number 1 on this really short list is really quite simple. Use the biggest brush possible for the task at hand, right? So part of learning how to do this is when you can be messy and when you can be neat. But even if you're trying to be neat, right? So like I have this brush that I use quite often, cheap, like $1 synthetic brush. And so long as it maintains a point, I can do pretty decent detail work with it. And the reason why you want to use the biggest brush as much as possible is simply because the biggest brush, or the bigger the brush, more paint can be held on it, for longer, so that way you don't have to keep going back to your palette or doing anything like that. You can focus working on the model and being in the zone painting rather than having to go back and get more paint. Because when you're doing that, 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, 40 times, because you have a really, really small finite brush, that all adds up. That all takes longer. And, you got maybe 10 models, 20 models, 30 models to paint, and you're going back 10, 20, 30 times for each model for a given color. All of that adds up over time. So biggest brush that you can for the job that you're doing. So for item number 2 is really quite simple. Don't be comparing yourself to others. That's really what it comes down to, right? And by others, I mean like places that do this professionally, right? So Dogs of War, Den of Imagination. Hell, you know what? Even the box art itself, right? You starting out are not going to produce models to this quality. And you're not going to produce studio level qualities for these other places, especially those guys that are trying to do it for commission. You're not even going to come close. It doesn't matter how many YouTube tutorials that you viewed. It doesn't matter how many step-by-step guides you viewed. It doesn't matter. There's a lot to this hobby, and as well as most artistic works, that you got to just do it, and you got to get time under your belt, so that way ultimately your skills will improve. But when you're just starting out, you're nowhere close, right? Instead, what you should be doing is trying to basically compare yourself to your last model, right? Your first model is going to be garbage, but that's fine. Your second model will be less garbage. Then after that, a little less, and then a little less. So long as you are constantly trying to improve yourself compared to the last model that you did, or the last batch of models, say like a batch of 5 or a batch of 10 or however much, you're going to make a lot of progress pretty quickly. You may not see it necessarily on an individual model basis, but you'll see over a course of say 6 months or a year or something like that, you're going to have a lot more skills under your belt, things that you just natively have been picking up just because you've been practicing. So again, don't compare yourself to these guys. Compare yourself to your last model. So for item number 1 on this list, and this is something that I personally struggle with most of the time, virtually every single model. And it's quite simple. It's like an uncanny valley in that the models that you're painting are going to look worse before they get better, right? Let me say it again. They're going to get worse before they get better. And that seems kind of weird, but hear me out. here's a model that I got that it's assembled, but it's not primed, right? So you can see all of the detail, everything that you want. You can sit there and picture what it is that, what kind of color scheme that you want, and everything's basically in your head. It's perfect. You can visualize how you're going to get there from step A to Z and all that good stuff. Unrealized, untapped potential. So you can be excited about it, right? But as you start painting, the details are going to start becoming obscured. Right? Even, no matter how thin you do your paints, the details are going to be obscured because you haven't washed it yet and other little details and things like that. And this is not going to be the unrealized, untapped potential anymore. Instead, it's going to look like something, like this, where, I got a Custodes bike here that I'm painting and it's just base coated right now with the gold and it looks like garbage, right? And justly so. And it's, in pieces. It's in 4 different pieces, little pieces on sticks and what have you. No big deal. But that's fine. The models are going to look worse once you start putting a paint on them. And as you put paint on them, it's going to get worse and worse and worse and worse. You're probably going to think that you're actually going away from your vision, that you're making mistakes. But eventually, if you keep at it, you're going to hit a point where the model looks like garbage, and then you're going to put that one layer of paint on, and now it doesn't look like garbage anymore. It looks good. You can actually start seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. So to help combat this, if you have, say, a squad of 5 Marines or however much that you want to do, try to finish one of them first, right? Just one of them, and use that as a template, right? That way, like for example, I did that with these Custodes, right? I finished one, so that way I know that how I'm getting there from point A to point B, that this is the end result. So that way, that entire time going through, and I'm going through that uncanny valley thinking that this looks like garbage, I know what the end result is. So I can, push through, right? And it's much easier to maintain that level of commitment when you only have one model that you're doing, as opposed to a batch of 5, especially something like Custodes where they have all these little fiddly bits and it just takes forever to paint them. So keep that in mind, that your models are going to get worse before they get better. And that's it. Those are the 3 tips that I'd like to give newcomers to this hobby, something other than your bog standard, thin your paints or your, wet palette or some of the other basics. More so mental things, so that way you can help get through that initial hurdle of painting your models, especially your initial models, because you don't know what you're doing. So it helps to keep certain aspects in mind that things will get better. Now, with that said, if you did like that video, I would greatly appreciate it if you gave it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, or if you want, put a comment down in the comment section. I'd like to talk to you guys. But other than that, have a good New Year's, and I'll talk to you all later.